How did people sleep in medieval castles without freezing to death? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a world of flickering candlelight, cold stone corridors, and the gentle sound of someone coughing in the next room because windows hadn't been invented properly yet. We're going to medieval Europe, a land of knights, kings, and drafty castles. It's easy to imagine them as romantic places, grand, towering fortresses lit by torchlight, full of feasts, troubadours, and roaring fires. But the truth was colder, much colder, because for all their grandeur, castles were basically elaborate refrigerators made of rock. And the question isn't so much how did people live in them, it's how did they sleep there without freezing to death. So, settle in, dim the lights, maybe wrap yourself in a blanket, and let's drift back to a time when sleeping comfortably meant not waking up covered in frost. Castles. As we imagine them, those grand stone structures perched on hills were designed for defense, not coziness. They were built to withstand sieges, not provide comfort. The walls were thick, the windows small, and insulation was something the medieval world had not yet invented, unless you count another layer of wool. In summer, that was fine. The thick stone kept things cool. But in winter, it was like living inside a beautifully decorated icebox. Now, it's worth remembering that castle meant different things depending on who you were. A minor knight might live in a fortified manor, basically a big stone house with delusions of grandeur. But a king or a great lord would live in a proper fortress, high towers, great halls, and rooms large enough to echo your regrets. And the problem with large rooms is that they're impossible to heat. A roaring fire looks romantic in paintings, but the average medieval hearth produced more smoke than warmth. Chimneys were rare before the 12th century. Instead, smoke just drifted out through holes in the ceiling, occasionally bringing the ceiling with it. If you were lucky, the air would clear before bedtime. If not, you'd go to sleep smelling like smoked ham. Though, to be fair, that was an upgrade for most medieval noses. Let's start with the bedroom, or rather, what passed for one. In most castles, people didn't sleep in separate bedrooms like we do today. Privacy was a luxury, and even the powerful rarely had much of it. A lord and lady might have their own chamber, a slightly smaller, marginally warmer room attached to the great hall. But even then, they weren't alone. Servants slept nearby, ready to fetch water or ward off assassins, and sometimes children slept in the same space too. The air would be thick with the smell of people, animals, tallow candles, and damp wool. Comfortable? It was not. So how did they stay warm? Layers. So many layers. The medieval bed was a carefully constructed fortress of its own. At the bottom was a wooden frame strung with ropes or leather strips, a primitive spring system that needed tightening every few weeks. On top of that went a mattress stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool, depending on your wealth and tolerance for insects. Then came the sheets, blankets and quilts the wealthy might have, linen sheets and fur covers. The poor made do with rough wool and whatever they could scavenge from nature's more cooperative animals. And then came the curtains, yes, curtains. Around the bed itself, they weren't for privacy, they were insulation. The medieval four-poster bed was less a design choice and more a survival mechanism. Those heavy fabric drapes trapped what little heat your body produced and kept out the worst of the drafts. You'd crawl in, pull the curtains tight, and hope your breath didn't freeze before morning. It's not exactly a luxury spa, but in a world without central heating, it worked. But warmth wasn't the only concern. There was also the matter of sharing. Most people didn't sleep alone. Beds were expensive, large. Funds were status symbols, so sharing them was normal. Family members, servants, even guests might share a bed, fully clothed, just to conserve heat. It wasn't considered improper, just practical. The idea of having your own private bed was, for most of history, unthinkable. And in monasteries, where privacy was a sin waiting to happen, monks often slept side by side in large dormitories, each wrapped in a coarse blanket, and the Lord's disapproval of comfort. Children often shared beds with their parents or siblings. Travelers might share with strangers at inns, though the risk of fleas, theft, or awkward conversation was high. One early traveler wrote of spending the night in a French inn, waking up to find that his bedfellow, a stranger, had stolen his boots. When confronted, the thief claimed it was an accident, which was probably the medieval equivalent of "sorry, bro." Now, let's talk about temperature. If you've ever spent a winter in Northern Europe, you'll know the cold there isn't playful. It's the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you question your life choices. In the Middle Ages, winters were even harsher. We're talking about the so-called Little Ice Age, a period between the 14th and 19th centuries when average temperatures were a few degrees colder than today. That doesn't sound like much, but when your house is made of stone and has windows the size of pigeonholes, it's noticeable. Inside, you could see your breath. Water in the wash basin would freeze overnight. Ink stiffened in the inkwell. One 15th century writer complained that the cold is such that words freeze in the air and are only heard when they thaw in spring. He was exaggerating, probably, but not by much. So, aside from bed curtains and body heat, how else did people survive the chill? Fireplaces were a big improvement. By the 13th century, many castles had them, with real chimneys that actually carried smoke away instead of just redistributing it creatively. But even then, fireplaces were inefficient. They radiated heat forward, not outward. So unless you were practically sitting in the fire, you'd still be cold. And of course, wood was expensive. So, fires were often allowed to burn low during the night. Servants or guards might keep watch in shifts, feeding the embers occasionally, But most households simply bundled up and hoped for the best. Clothing was another. Defense medieval people slept in what we might now call nightshirts, long linen garments that reached the ankles. They weren't glamorous, but they trapped warmth. The rich might wear fur-lined bedgowns. The poor might just wear the same clothes they worked in, which made mornings simpler if nothing else. And yes, contrary to the myths, medieval people did bathe, just not often, which means their bedclothes did double duty as insulation and air filtration systems. Add in a few woolen socks, a cap to cover your head, and maybe a small dog or two at your feet, known affectionately as bed warmers, and you might just make it through till morning. Speaking of actual bed warmers, the medievals had those, too. A common device was a brass or copper pan filled with hot coals, slid between the sheets before bed to take the chill off. Of course, if you weren't careful, it also set the bed on fire, which made for an exciting but short night's sleep. The less flammable alternative was the stone pig, a smooth, heated stone wrapped in cloth and tucked at the foot of the bed. Some were carved into decorative shapes, though it's hard to say how comforting it was to cuddle a warm rock shaped like a boar. Still, it worked. And for peasants, a simpler version, a brick or clay pot heated in the hearth, served just as well. Let's drift for a moment to the Great Hall, the beating heart of every castle. This was where most of the household ate, worked, and, in winter, slept. The lord's family might retire to private chambers, but servants and guests often just unrolled bedding near the fire. At night, the hall would be lined with sleeping figures, wrapped in cloaks and blankets, the air thick with the mingled scent of smoke, wax, and humanity. It was crowded, noisy, and probably smelled like victory. If victory involved wet wool and roasted meat, but compared to the freezing courtyards and howling winds outside, it was paradise. Even kings weren't immune to the cold. Take Henry VIII, for example. Despite his wealth, his palaces were notoriously drafty. He had hundreds of fireplaces built across Hampton Court and Whitehall, but the scale of the buildings meant that no amount of wood could make them truly warm. Tryphene, king himself, slept under mountains of quilts, wearing a fur-lined nightgown and cap, and in particularly cold winters, servants placed braziers, small portable fire bowls, near his bed. Of course, that also increased the risk of asphyxiation, but when you're Henry VIII, you assume air itself is loyal to you. For the poor, things were simpler, and somehow more efficient. Peasants lived in one-room cottages shared with their animals. The body heat of cows, pigs, and chickens helped warm the space. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. They slept on straw mattresses near the hearth, wrapped in cloaks, often with the family huddled together, children, dogs, and livestock, all part of the same ecosystem of survival. When the fire went out, they simply pulled closer. It wasn't comfort, it was community. And then, of course, there were the superstitions. The medieval world was full of beliefs about sleep and the night. Cold was thought to invite illness, or worse, spirits. So, people hung charms by the bed, burned herbs, or muttered prayers against the cold and whatever else might be creeping in through the cracks. St. Blaise was popular for protecting throats, St. Lawrence for fires, St. Bridget for warmth and hearths. What happened to the richest medieval women after their husbands died? The widow's hour. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a world where death was common, wealth was concentrated, and women were mostly expected to stand quietly beside whichever man owned them at the time. But every so often, the system broke. A husband died first. And just like that, a woman found herself in possession of land, titles, and the most dangerous thing in the Middle Ages, independence. So, if you've dimmed the lights and settled in, we'll wander gently through the candlelit corridors of medieval Europe, where a widow could be both powerful and profoundly unsafe. Because while a dead husband might free her from obedience, it rarely freed her from attention. The price of freedom. Let's begin with something practical. In medieval Europe, a woman's life was measured in contracts. Marriage contracts, dowries, inheritance charters. When she married, her wealth usually became her husband's. When he died, some of it came back. Not all, of course. That would have been far too simple. What she received was called a dower, a portion of his estate that was legally hers for life. In theory, this meant comfort and stability. In practice, it meant endless paperwork, lawsuits, and the occasional attempt on her life. The Church, ever helpful, declared widows protected, meaning they couldn't be forced to remarry. But couldn't be forced, in medieval terms, was flexible. Families pressured, kings intervened, and ambitious men lined up with rings and politely threatening smiles. A wealthy widow was a prize. She came with land, influence, and often her late husband's political connections. And all you had to do to claim them was make her say, "I do," again. The widow's courtship season. The weeks after a nobleman's death were, quite literally, open season. A widow was expected to mourn, but also to be strategic. There was a delicate choreography to it. Too much grief, and people whispered she was hysterical. Too little, and they assumed she'd done it herself. So she wept just enough. In public, of course, wore black, attended Mass, and then quietly began to weigh her options. Because the truth was, a medieval widow did have options, more than at any other point in her life. She could remarry, and choose for herself if she was quick and careful. She could enter a convent, securing peace and safety, if not exactly joy, or she could do the unthinkable: remain single. Staying single was seen as mildly scandalous. It made people nervous. A woman with money, unclaimed by any man, was a disruption to the natural order of things. And as history shows us, medieval Europe didn't handle disruptions gracefully. Lady Rich, Lady Dangerous. One of the best examples comes from 12th century England. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who could honestly have bought half of France if she'd wanted to. Eleanor was, at various points, both Queen of France and Queen of England. She married 2 kings, produced 8 children, and managed to outlive nearly everyone who tried to control her. When her first husband, King Louis VII, divorced her, she left court with her lands intact, and was immediately ambushed on the road by men trying to kidnap her for marriage. Not out of love, of course, out of real estate. She was one of the wealthiest women in Europe, and whoever married her would instantly become one of the most powerful men alive. Eleanor, being Eleanor, evaded all of them, and instead chose to marry Henry Plantagenet, a handsome, ambitious man 10 years her junior, who would soon become King Henry II Second of England. It was, briefly, a love match. Then it became a power struggle, and eventually it became imprisonment. After Henry's death, Eleanor was free again, and once more she wielded that freedom like a blade. In her 70s, she arranged royal marriages across Europe, negotiated treaties, and advised her son Richard the Lionheart from behind the scenes. But even she, one of the most formidable women in history, spent much of her life battling against the simple fact that widowed women were supposed to fade quietly into the background. When widowhood became a trap, not all widows had Eleanor's iron will or her fleet of armed guards. Most were surrounded by vultures, family, clergy, and opportunistic men eager to get their hands on what she held. In England, the crown technically had custody of wealthy widows. Kings could decide who they married next, or sell that right to the highest bidder. Henry III made a small fortune doing exactly that, auctioning off widows like they were royal horses. He even fined some women simply for refusing the suitors he'd chosen. One widow, Lady Agnes of Cornwall, paid the crown an enormous sum in 1262, just to be left alone, the medieval equivalent of buying her own solitude. It worked for a while, but then her cousins sued her over her dower lands, arguing she was unfit to manage property without male supervision, which was, of course, the entire point. And that's the recurring theme of this story. Freedom always came at a price. If a widow wanted control, she had to fight for it, usually in court, occasionally with poison, and sometimes by retreating entirely from the world. The cloistered escape. For some, the simplest solution was to stop being a woman at all, at least legally speaking. Entering a convent was a way to exit the chessboard. Once you were a nun, no one could marry you off, sue you for your property, or question your virtue. You were, technically, Bride of Christ, which sounds romantic until you remember how bad medieval heating was. Many wealthy widows chose this path, donating land to the church in exchange for peace and perpetual prayers. It was an act of piety, yes, but also a shrewd transaction. A convent was a safe house disguised as holiness. Inside, a widow could write letters, sponsor manuscripts, and quietly oversee her estates from afar, provided she worded everything in suitably humble Latin. Some even built entire nunneries of their own, becoming abbesses with near-feudal authority, which, when you think about it, was just another form of power, this time draped in linen and silence. The widow as patron, but not all of them, vanished behind cloister walls. Many used their widowhood as an opportunity to become patrons. The art collectors, builders, and benefactors of their age. Take Margaret of Anjou, the widowed queen of Henry VI. After her husband was killed in the Wars of the Roses, she lived out her days in quiet exile in France. Not quite royal anymore, not quite forgotten. She funded churches, hosted poets, and maintained a tiny court of displaced English loyalists, all while being politely ignored by everyone else, or Isabella of France, the she-wolf of France, widow of Edward II. She had helped overthrow her husband, admittedly not a model spouse, and then ruled England for several years alongside her lover, Roger Mortimer. When her son Edward III grew old enough to resent this, he staged a coup, executed Mortimer, and politely imprisoned his mother. Still, even in confinement, Isabella kept her lands, servants, and dignity. A small empire of velvet vengeance. Widowhood, for these women, was less an ending than a shift in lighting. The public glare of queenship dimmed, but the shadows became their domain. Money, mourning, and manipulation. It's easy to imagine the medieval widow as tragic, sitting by a hearth in endless black veils. And yes, some did exactly that. But others used mourning as performance art. Widows were expected to grieve for at least a year, during which they were legally untouchable for remarriage. A clever woman could stretch that period indefinitely. Black became both armor and signal. I am inconsolable. Which really meant, don't bother me until I've settled the estate. Contemporary accounts describe noble widows commissioning, elaborate tombs, sponsoring masses, and wearing extravagant mourning jewels, all technically symbols of humility, but also very expensive advertisements of power. Even grief in the Middle Ages was a currency. One chronicler noted that after her husband's death, Joan de Valence attired herself in the deepest sable cloth and daily gave alms to the poor in his name, which sounds devout, until you learn she also spent most of those alms purchasing more land. Charity, medieval style. The widow's house. In some cases, widows maintained their own miniature courts, half households, half fortresses. They lived with servants, confessors, and the occasional suspicious nephew waiting for them to die. Many became local power brokers. They arranged marriages, settled disputes, and dispensed charity. And while they couldn't hold formal office, everyone knew that behind the scenes, they often controlled far more than any official ever admitted. In letters and chronicles, widows are constantly described as prudent, wise, and discreet, which were medieval code words for politically terrifying. A man could be ambitious. A woman had to be discreet. One example, Matilda de Clare, AIADT, 13th century English noblewoman who managed vast estates after her husband's death. When a group of local barons tried to pressure her into marriage, she calmly fortified her manor, hired guards, and refused to let them in. She wrote to the king explaining that she preferred to keep her widowhood unblemished, which sounds saintly until you realize it's basically medieval for kindly mind your own business. The widow's reputation. Despite these small victories, the social suspicion never lifted. A rich widow was always halfway to scandal. If she was too pious, she was hiding something. If she was too lively, she was immoral. And if she was too quiet, well, she was clearly plotting. Why did so many royals think they could cure diseases by touch? Hey everyone, tonight, we're drifting back to a world where kings and queens didn't just rule their subjects, they healed them. Or at least, they thought they did. A time when royal power wasn't measured only in land, armies, or the number of tapestries in your hall, but in the supposed ability to cure diseases with a single touch. Yes, the miraculous, mildly unhygienic practice known as the royal touch. So, settle in, let the lights fade down, because tonight, we're going to wander through a few centuries of kings putting their hands on strangers and confidently declaring them cured. It's equal parts history, theology, and uncomfortable personal space. The idea that monarchs could heal by touch might sound bizarre now. And to be fair, it was bizarre then, too. But for medieval and early modern people, it made perfect sense, after all. Kings ruled by God's grace. They were divinely chosen, which was convenient for them. And that divine status, supposedly, came with certain perks. Chief, among them, the power to heal diseases. And not just any disease. The big one was scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that caused swelling and sores in the neck and lymph nodes. It was also known as the King's Evil, which must have been a awkward name to carry if you happened to be the king. But for centuries, thousands of people genuinely believed that if a monarch touched them, they could be healed. The kings of England and France, in particular, took this idea and ran with it, all the way to the point of scheduling regular miracle sessions. Imagine that as a royal duty, not signing decrees or reviewing troops, just spending the morning patting hundreds of sick peasants on the neck. The origins of this belief are misty, as many medieval ideas are. But it seems to have started in France around the 11th century with King Robert the Pious, son of Hugh Capet. Robert was, by all accounts, devout, gloomy, and possibly a little too fond of relics. He was said to have cured scrofula by making the sign of the cross over a sufferer. And that was all it took. Word spread, stories grew, and before long it was accepted truth that French kings had a healing gift. Not because of medical training, of course. They weren't even washing regularly, but because God liked them best. Soon after, the English monarchy decided that sounded like a lovely idea, and promptly stole it. This was around the time of Edward the Confessor in the 11th century, a man so pious he was later made a saint, and so indecisive he probably would have been fired from any real job. Edward supposedly began healing scrofula by touch as well, perhaps out of genuine faith, perhaps because the French were doing it, and he didn't want to seem less miraculous. And so, a new royal duty was born. For the next 7 centuries, English and French monarchs would continue this practice with utter sincerity. Royal healing sessions became massive public events, carefully choreographed to blend charity, religion, and public relations. If you're imagining an intimate, spiritual moment, one sick person, one gentle royal hand, think again. These sessions could involve hundreds of people, sometimes thousands, all lined up, coughing and bandaged, waiting for their divine handshake. The king would sit on a throne, draped in cloth of gold, and one by one, the sufferers would kneel before him. He'd touch their face or neck, perhaps make the sign of the cross, and say a few holy words. Then they'd receive a coin, a touch piece, often a gold or silver medal, inscribed with a cross or a saint's image. The coin wasn't just a souvenir. It was believed to carry healing power of its own, kind of like a royal brand talisman. So, yes, medieval kings were literally handing out branded merch with their miraculous touch. Early marketing at its finest. Let's drift for a moment to the 14th century, when the Black Death was still fresh in memory, and everyone was very interested in not dying. The royal touch took on new importance then. A.B. Tangible link between the monarch and the divine. When everything else failed, prayer, herbs, bleeding, people still had the king. By then, the French and English royal lines were competing not only for land, but for holiness. Both claimed their lineage was sacred, both touched for scrofula, and both accused the other of faking it. The 100 Years' War might have been partly about territory, but spiritually, it was also a battle of miracles. Now, as for the results, yes, some people really did report being cured, sometimes dramatically. Of course, we now understand that scrofula can go into remission on its own, which helped the illusion along. But at the time, every recovery was proof of divine favor, and so monarchs kept touching and touching and touching. During the 17th century, King Charles II of England, he of the magnificent wigs and numerous mistresses, really took it to the next level. Charles touched over 90,000 people during his reign. Yes, 90,000. The man had a busier healing schedule than most doctors today. He had special touching for the king's evil tokens, stamped with his portrait and a Latin prayer. It was part medicine, part PR, and entirely absurd. But people loved it, because it made their king seem holy, accessible, and gloriously powerful. It's worth pausing here to imagine the scene. Picture Westminster, Hall in the 1660s, the air thick with incense and the faint smell of illness. Rows upon rows of hopeful subjects, some with swollen throats, others with bandaged faces, all waiting their turn. Charles II enters, perfumed, elegant, faintly hung over. He sits, stretches out a bejeweled hand, and the line begins. One by one, the sick kneel, and he touches them. A murmured prayer, a flash of coin, and on to the next. Over and over. For hours. By the end, he's probably as tired as they are, but his reputation as a healer, and therefore a divinely chosen monarch, grows stronger with each tap. Let's drift over to France for a moment, where Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, also performed the royal touch. Naturally, he did it with maximum spectacle. Louis rarely missed a chance for pageantry. He performed the ceremony in full regalia, often after Easter Mass, in front of vast crowds. But whereas Charles II seemed to enjoy the theater of it, Louis approached it like holy work. He would bless thousands, one after another, murmuring, "Dieu te guérisse," God heal you. The sun. King was glowing, of course. His patience, less so. Still, the belief persisted. Only the true King of France could heal the king's evil. And when the monarchy was overthrown during the French Revolution, that belief died too, briefly. Then, when Louis XVI returned in the 19th century, a few hopeful people actually showed up asking for the royal touch again. Old habits die hard. But not everyone loved this whole miracle business. Some church officials grumbled that it blurred the line between holiness and hubris. After all, weren't saints supposed to perform miracles? Not politicians? And scientists, those few quiet heretics of reason, found it deeply embarrassing. By the Enlightenment, the royal touch was looking increasingly awkward. The idea that a monarch's hand contained divine antibodies didn't sit well with the age of Newton. Even so, it lingered. King George I of England politely refused to touch anyone for the king's evil, saying he was a king of England, not a physician. But some people still believed the power was real. They just decided he didn't have it because he was German. A tidy little piece of national logic. Interestingly, the ritual also had a very political purpose. It wasn't just about healing. It was about proving legitimacy. If you could heal, you must be the rightful ruler. That's why pretenders and usurpers avoided performing the ceremony. If the people didn't believe, it might backfire. The touch was as much propaganda as it was piety. A way of showing that kings were not mere men, but living vessels of grace, and the longer it went on, the harder it became to admit it was nonsense. After all, if your great-great-grandfather cured thousands by touch, what does it say about you if you can't cure anyone at all? Best to keep up the tradition and pretend it's still working. There were even manuals for how to perform it. Clergy supervised the ceremonies to ensure proper decorum. Assistants managed the crowd and distributed the coins. Everything had to look orderly, reverent, and convincingly sacred. Because nothing kills the mood of divine healing like watching someone sneeze on the royal robes. And it's worth noting, the recipients believed it utterly. For many, it was their only hope. Medicine was unreliable, and most doctors were either butchers or philosophers. So the king's touch was not only a miracle, it was accessible health care. It's oddly tender, in a way. A sick, frightened peasant travels for days to kneel before a glittering monarch. He feels the warmth of the royal hand, hears the whispered blessing, and believes himself healed. Maybe he really does feel better. Placebo, prayer, or simply hope, it hardly matters. For a moment, he's seen, and for a medieval subject, that was perhaps the most miraculous thing of all. By the 18th century, though, the magic was wearing thin. Doctors began rolling their eyes. Clergy became cautious. And kings, increasingly burdened with wars, debt, and revolutions, found less time for mass healing events. When Queen Anne of England performed the ceremony in 1712, it was one of the last serious occasions. Among her patients was a small boy named Samuel Johnson, the future dictionary writer. He kept the coin his entire life, though sadly, it didn't cure his scrofula. The whispering men, who ruled from the shadows, hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter, stranger corner of history, one where power hummed softly through marble corridors, and the most dangerous men in the empire wore silk robes, and no one feared them quite enough. So, dim the lights. Let your phone fall somewhere onto the pillow beside you, and let's talk about the eunuchs, the men without heirs, without legacies, but somehow, for a few centuries at least, with all the power in the world. Because here's the thing. Every great empire seems to have had them. The soft-spoken officials in gilded rooms, the keepers of secrets, the guardians of women who weren't supposed to be seen. They appear quietly in the background of ancient texts. In Byzantium, in China, in the Ottoman palace, always unnamed, but always there, whispering into the ears of kings, writing edicts no one else dared to read, and sometimes deciding, discreetly, who lived or died. And then, just as quietly, they disappear, which makes you wonder, what actually happened to them? After centuries of controlling courts, how did these men, these state-sponsored outsiders, vanish almost completely? That's where we're headed tonight. We'll drift slowly through 1,000 years of history, from the purple halls of Constantinople to the perfumed shadows of the Forbidden City, to find out what life and death looked like for the most powerful people who technically didn't exist. Let's start with something simple. Why did anyone think this was a good idea? Why, in so many different civilizations, did kings, emperors, and caliphs decide that the best person to trust with their secrets was someone who had been surgically prevented from having too much of a personal life? It's not as odd as it sounds, at least not by ancient standards. In almost every society with a palace, the ruler's biggest worry was the same: Who can I trust near my women, my children, and my throne? And the answer apparently was someone who cannot technically reproduce, and therefore cannot found a rival dynasty. You could put him in the harem, or in the treasury, or in the room where all the inconvenient documents were kept. He couldn't seduce the queen, or sire a usurper, or build an army of sons with inheritance claims. He was, in theory, loyal only to the crown, and entirely disposable. That was the theory. The reality was a little more complicated. Because when you fill a palace with intelligent, ambitious men who have no family, no exit, and nothing to lose, what you tend to get is the most ruthless political class imaginable. Let's take a short stroll to Byzantium, the empire that took bureaucracy, baptized it, and wrapped it in purple silk. In Constantinople, eunuchs were everywhere. They ran the imperial bedchamber, the treasury, the church, and sometimes the empire itself. The Byzantines were nothing if not practical. They realized early on that castration, while a bit grisly, made for extremely loyal servants. A eunuch couldn't pass his job to a son, so he tended to serve longer, work harder, and, ideally, die quietly at his desk. Some didn't get the memo. Take Basil Lekapenos, for instance, an imperial chamberlain in the 10th century. Born the illegitimate son of an emperor, he was gelded young to make him politically safe. Naturally, he then went on to become one of the most powerful men in Byzantine history. Basil wasn't technically allowed to rule, so he did what many eunuchs did. He ruled through other people. He placed his puppets on the throne, forged alliances with generals, and quietly pocketed more gold than the empire technically owned. At one point, the emperor discovered that Basil's private fortune was larger than the imperial treasury itself, which, to be fair, was impressive, if not exactly legal. Basil was exiled, of course, but he left behind a template that many others would follow. The eunuch as shadow emperor. The man no one could dethrone, because, technically, he wasn't even on the throne to begin with. The Byzantines even had different ranks of eunuchs. There were the palace ones, the clerical ones, and the especially unfortunate boys who were gifted to the emperor by foreign rulers, trying to curry favor. Some were made eunuchs, voluntarily, though voluntary is doing a lot of work. There, others were captives, enslaved as children, and never given a choice at all. For many, the surgery was a death sentence. Castration, in the early Middle Ages, was less of a procedure and more of a gamble with infection. But those who survived sometimes rose higher than anyone could imagine. They could be patricios, a courtly rank just below the emperor himself. They could lead armies, though officially they weren't supposed to. They could become bishops or patriarchs, or even so powerful that they were referred to simply as the eunuch, as if there were only one. And maybe that's how it felt. A single quiet figure, robed in white, standing just behind the emperor's throne, hands folded, expression unreadable, the empire's conscience, or perhaps its jailer. But for all their influence, their lives were lonely. The Byzantines admired them, but never really loved them. Eunuchs were often barred from marriage, and while some kept discreet companions, they lived in a world where affection was a liability. Imagine living your whole life in rooms filled with whispers, knowing everything, belonging nowhere. It's not surprising that so many eunuchs poured their ambitions into the only thing left to them: control. And when the Byzantine Empire finally crumbled, it wasn't swords or cannons that ended their power, it was bureaucracy itself. The empire's complex system of ranks and office collapsed into dust, and with it went the last of the official eunuch hierarchy. After the fall of Constantinople, those who survived found themselves suddenly irrelevant. The new Ottoman rulers had their own system and their own eunuchs, which brings us, gently, to the next great chapter in the saga of imperial servitude. Let's drift over now to Istanbul, or as it was still known to some, Constantinople reborn. The Ottoman court had inherited much of the Byzantine fascination with order, ritual, and secrecy, and it added something else: a harem the size of a small city. Now, when most people hear harem, they think of something wildly inaccurate, half Orientalist fantasy, half French painting. In reality, the harem was not a pleasure dome. It was a political institution, a place where imperial mothers, wives, and concubines raised the next generation of sultans, and where every conversation, every glance was part of a struggle for influence. And who stood guard over all of it? The eunuchs. The Ottoman system divided them into two main groups: the white eunuchs and the black eunuchs. The white eunuchs, often from the Balkans, handled administrative duties: scribes, clerks, and palace managers. The black eunuchs, mostly enslaved Africans, guarded the harem itself and served the sultan's mother, the Valide Sultan. And in time, it was the black eunuchs who came to dominate the palace. The head of them all, the Kuzlar Aga, or chief black eunuch, was arguably the second most powerful man in the empire. He controlled access to the harem. He spoke daily with the sultan's mother. He could make or unmake viziers with a word. It was said that if the sultan's mother wished something done, she would whisper it to the chief eunuch, and by morning it would happen. But this power came at a terrible cost. The black eunuchs were usually enslaved boys taken from Sudan, Ethiopia, or Eritrea. They were mutilated before being sent north, sometimes completely castrated, a procedure with a survival rate so low that only the strongest made it to Istanbul alive. If they survived, they were trained in silence, discipline, and obedience, and if they rose high enough, they could live in luxury beyond imagining: gold, servants, fine robes, yet they remained forever. outside the world they served. No family, no legacy, no escape, even in death. Their graves were often marked only by their title, never their family name. Still, some found ways to build quiet legacies. The Kuzlar Agas funded schools, fountains, and mosques. Their names survive on Ottoman inscriptions, hidden among the marble tiles of Istanbul. One of the most famous, Hacı Beşir Aga, was said to be both deeply pious and quietly terrifying. He ruled the harem for nearly 30 years, amassed a fortune, and used it to fund soup kitchens and libraries. His mosque still stands, its calligraphy faintly whispering his name. He was, in every sense, the ultimate paradox, a man of immense influence who left behind no bloodline, only buildings and rumors. By the 19th century, though, the Ottoman world was changing. Reformers, mostly Western-educated men, looked at the eunuchs and saw only an embarrassment. They wanted railways, parliaments, and constitutional monarchies, not palace servants from a medieval age. So, slowly, the eunuchs faded away. Their roles were absorbed by ministries. The harems were dissolved. And one day, quietly, the office of Chief Black, eunuch simply ceased to exist. The last men to hold the E title lived long enough to see telegraphs and steamships, modernity itself passing them by like a train they could never board. And when they died, the era of the imperial eunuch, spanning nearly 2,000 years, died with them. But before we say goodnight to them entirely, there's one more empire we should visit, far older, far grander, and infinitely more bureaucratic. Because if Byzantium and the Ottomans perfected the art of palace intrigue, then China industrialized it, and that's where we'll drift next. The quiet days of Death's employee, hey everyone, tonight. We're drifting back to a world where death had a schedule, a world where someone actually had to show up to work and make sure justice, or at least the loud, messy, theatrical version of it, got done, yes. Tonight we're talking about medieval and early modern executioners, the people who, for centuries, held one of the most reviled yet indispensable jobs in society. Feared, hated, and occasionally underpaid. But what happened when there was nothing to execute? What did they do between beheadings? Go ahead, dim the lights. Let your mind wander somewhere vaguely German, vaguely damp, and imagine the sound of a whetstone on steel fading into the background. We tend to imagine executioners as permanent fixtures, looming, hooded, standing in the square at dawn, axe in hand. But that was only a tiny fraction of their time. For most of the year, the executioner wasn't executing anyone. He was waiting, and in that waiting, he somehow became one of the strangest, most contradictory characters of medieval life. Executioners were, in theory, public servants. They were paid by the city to carry out capital punishment. But they weren't considered respectable at all. Their work was necessary, but their presence was unpleasant. like rats or lawyers. So even when there were no executions, the executioner remained marked by his profession. The German word for one, Scharfrichter, literally means sharp judge, which sounds powerful until you realize that most people crossed the street to avoid making eye contact with him. The first problem was where to live most. Cities didn't want their executioner living among the normal citizens, so they were often given a house just outside the city walls, near the gallows, the leper house, or the tannery. Basically, if it smelled bad or scared people, that's where you put the executioner. Still, it wasn't all misery. Many of them had good salaries. Cities needed them on retainer, because you never knew when someone might commit treason or steal a bishop's horse. So the executioner was paid a steady wage, often including housing, free firewood, and the right to collect. Interesting bonuses. Let's talk about those. Because when there were no executions, the executioner made money in other creative ways. His main side hustle? Medicine. Yes, you heard that right. The man who swung the axe was also the local doctor, or at least the alternative kind. Executioners had unparalleled access to fresh human bodies, which, in the twisted medical logic of the time, made them experts in anatomy. So when you had a dislocated shoulder or needed bloodletting, you didn't always go to a barber surgeon. Sometimes you went to the guy who decapitated people for a living, because naturally he had experience. There are records from Nuremberg and Augsburg, cities in the Holy Roman Empire, where executioners kept side businesses as bone setters and healers. They treated broken limbs, pulled teeth, even delivered babies. And oddly enough, they were good at it. They understood wounds in a very practical way. In fact, the famous 16th century Nuremberg executioner, Franz Schmidt, kept a meticulous diary of every punishment he performed, but also of every patient he treated. Over 15,000 of them. He healed far more people than he killed, which feels like karmic balance, in a way. When they weren't patching people up, executioners were also responsible for handling all the unpleasant leftovers of public justice. They cleaned the gallows, disposed of corpses, and occasionally displayed body parts as deterrents. A grisly maintenance job, but someone had to do it. It's one thing to hang a thief, it's another to climb up afterward and take him down before he starts falling apart in the sun. That was the executioner's problem, and because the job was considered unclean, nobody else would do it, so even on quiet weeks, the executioner stayed busy keeping the city's moral hygiene intact, like a janitor of sin. But when there really was nothing to kill, many turned to yet another occupation: animal control. Cities hired executioners to slaughter stray dogs, euthanize sick livestock, and manage pest infestations, which meant their work didn't stop. It just got furrier. Instead of hanging criminals, they were killing pigs that had wandered into the market square. And yes, sometimes they were called to execute animals officially. In medieval Europe, animals could be put on trial. Pigs, cows, goats, if they injured a person. They might face a symbolic trial and execution. Naturally, the town executioner handled that too, which meant that on some days his grand, grim stage was filled not with traitors, but with a particularly confused cow. Now, despite being shunned, executioners often lived surprisingly well. Their jobs were stable, their income steady. They were granted tax exemptions and, in some cases, the right to brew or sell alcohol, which might explain why so many of them also ran taverns. Imagine it. The local innkeeper pours you an ale, and you realize he's the same man who hanged your cousin last summer. A bit awkward, yes, but his beer was probably excellent. The executioner's social status, however, was complicated. They were considered dishonorable. They couldn't marry into respectable families, couldn't hold public office, and couldn't even take communion in some places. The stigma was so intense that their children often inherited it, becoming a kind of accidental caste. Many families of executioners stayed in the profession for generations, not because they loved it, but because no one else would hire them. It was hereditary exile. And yet, within that exile, they created a small subculture. Executioners often married the daughters of other executioners, or women from similar unclean trades, knackers, gravediggers, tanners. It was a closed world of people who handled what society didn't want to see. One of the strangest things about executioners is how bureaucratic their lives were. They kept careful records, requested permission for every act, and had to follow elaborate laws of procedure. Each punishment had its proper form, timing, and tools. A good executioner was efficient, precise, and above all, quiet, because a botched execution brought shame. If your axe missed its mark, the crowd turned ugly. Your reputation could collapse overnight. So they practiced. In the off-season, an executioner might sharpen his blades, test his rope tension, and rehearse movements, a professional's diligence applied to a rather horrifying craft. But beneath the reputation and ritual, most of them were just men trying to survive. And in their downtime, they did the same things as everyone else. They cooked, kept gardens, raised children, went hunting. They just happened to do it all under a cloud of permanent unease. If you were the city executioner, you could live comfortably, but you couldn't ever be normal. You were both employee and outcast, paid by the city, but barred from its society. You made a living cleaning up its moral mess, and it repaid you by pretending you didn't exist. In some cases, executioners were even liked, quietly. Their skills as healers or mediators made them indispensable. People who would never publicly greet them might secretly visit at night for a broken finger or a toothache. The hypocrisy was fragrant, but it worked. There's a record from France of an executioner's daughter who married a blacksmith, only for the town to riot. Not because they disliked her, but because they didn't want their respectable crafts contaminated. The marriage was annulled. The stigma was so strong it literally followed her to the altar. And yet, they had a strange kind of dignity. They took pride in doing their work correctly, in keeping order. They saw themselves as servants of justice, not its villains. Many executioners were surprisingly religious, believing they were instruments of divine will. Franz Schmidt, again, wrote in his diary that he had taken no life unjustly. He saw his role not as a killer, but as a purifier, a necessary hand of fate. It's morbid, but almost touching. He didn't see his axe as a weapon. He saw it as a duty. Now, what about when crime rates dropped? Because sometimes, even in the 16th century, things got quiet. No heretics, no murderers, no public enemies, just peace and boredom. That's when the job became civic. Executioners were often put to work maintaining the instruments of justice, repairing the scaffold, cleaning the torture chambers, even caring for the city's official sword. Imagine polishing your tools of death, like a gardener tending his pruning shears. They were also called on for less lethal displays, floggings, ear cropping, branding, and banishments, all of which paid extra. By the way, executioners were paid per limb, so to speak. And when those dried up too, they simply waited. Imagine sitting at your table, oiling your axe, hoping, but not too much, for someone to commit a crime. There's something both absurd and melancholy about it. The city couldn't live without him, but also couldn't bear to look at him. He was part of the machinery of order, but forever excluded from the comfort of belonging. And on the quiet days, the long stretches with no justice to dispense, he tended his herbs, treated his patients, and waited for the bell to ring. He was a man whose life was built around death, and yet most of his days were spent helping people live a little longer. Let's drift into the next part, where we'll look at the strange, secret world of executioner families, the dynasties of death, their love lives, inheritances, and what happened when an executioner wanted to retire. How did medieval people actually smell? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages, a place that, in most people's imagination, smells rather awful. The kind of place where soap was a rumor, sewage was a lifestyle, and perfume was considered a medical treatment. So, before you tuck in for the night, maybe light a little candle, settle under a blanket, and let's take a slow, sleepy wander through the scentscape of the medieval world. A time when cleanliness was relative, dirt was spiritual, and taking. A bath might get you excommunicated, or worse, married to a French nobleman. Let's begin with a simple truth. Yes, medieval people smelled different from us, but not quite the walking landfill of stereotypes you might imagine. They weren't constantly wading through piles of filth, humming green sleeves, covered in lice and despair. not all the time anyway. The smell of the Middle Ages was complicated, a mixture of wood smoke, wet wool, roasted meat, tallow candles, horse manure, and humanity. Imagine the scent of a damp church pew and a sheepfold that have somehow merged. That's roughly the aroma of an average 14th century street. But we should be fair to them. To medieval noses, it didn't smell bad. It just smelled normal, because of course it did. When everyone smells faintly of turnip and smoke, no one does. And interestingly, they were very aware of smell. In fact, odor was considered a direct reflection of morality. A good Christian smelled good. A sinner smelled suspiciously like sulfur. Your spiritual hygiene, they believed, affected your literal hygiene. The logic was simple. If your soul was rotten, your body would follow suit. So if Brother Matthew reeked faintly of goat and graveyard, perhaps he wasn't praying quite enough. Now, about bathing. People did bathe, sometimes quite a lot, depending on where and when you lived. The Romans had left behind a deep appreciation for public baths, and early medieval Europe inherited some of that. By the 12th and 13th centuries, many towns had stews, bathhouses that were less about stew and more about steaming naked conversation. Picture wooden tubs, warm water hauled in by hand, and a fire burning nearby. Men and women bathed together sometimes, because apparently the Middle Ages didn't get the modesty memo yet. And yes, the bathhouses often doubled as brothels, because of course they did. Still, bathing wasn't rare. Even the poorest people would wash their hands and faces daily, and clothes were laundered far more often than you'd think. Linen, especially, was prized for its ability to wick away dirt and sweat. The medieval version of moisture-wicking athletic wear. Except instead of yoga class, you were trudging through a plague-ridden marketplace trying not to die. Let's float over to the nobility for a moment. Royal hygiene was a fascinating blend of opulence and delusion. Take, for instance, Queen Isabella of Castile. She famously declared she'd only bathed twice in her life. Once at birth, and once before her wedding. Which sounds horrifying, until you realize that was probably an exaggeration. Still, it tells us how bathing came to be viewed by the late medieval period, as a potential moral hazard. Water, some theologians warned, could open the pores, and therefore invite sin, disease, and possibly the devil. So, for the sake of holiness, many devout nobles simply avoided it altogether. Imagine proudly skipping the bath to please God. That's dedication. But medieval royalty did try to smell pleasant. They just went about it in creative ways. Perfumed gloves, rosewater hand rinses, sachets of dried herbs sewn into clothing. The medieval deodorant aisle was elaborate. Some nobles had entire rooms filled with fragrant herbs to keep their linens fresh. Others simply relied on constant incense, ensuring that if they smelled bad, at least it was sanctified. Henry VIII, for example, was famously obsessed with scent. His chambers were perfumed daily with rosewater and sweet wood smoke, because nothing says, "I'm a divine monarch," quite like drowning out the smell of gout with cinnamon. Then there's the matter of teeth. Dental hygiene, surprisingly, wasn't entirely neglected. People used toothpicks made from silver or quills, and they rubbed their teeth with mixtures of salt and herbs. So if you were sitting beside a medieval lady at court, her breath might smell faintly of mint and ashes, which, in fairness, is still preferable to whatever the guy next to her was exhaling. But what about the peasants? Ah, yes, the unwashed masses. Contrary to what you've seen in movies, they didn't live permanently coated in mud. Sure, they worked hard and smelled of the outdoors, but they also had access to rivers, ponds, and communal washing spots. Peasants bathed when they could, and they were quite practical about it. If you're sweating through 10, you evolve into a different species. They also used plants like soapwort, which produced a natural lather. Imagine a field worker, waist deep in a stream, scrubbing his shirt with a handful of flowers. Not glamorous, but effective, and probably much nicer than we give them credit for. Let's drift now to the medieval city. If you've ever wondered what London smelled like around the year 1400, don't. But since we're here, imagine an open-air festival for every known form of waste. Human, animal, industrial, all politely coexisting in the street. Chamber pots were emptied into gutters, tannery runoff stained the cobbles, and fish markets were a daily sensory assault. The smell was constant, but again, it was simply the background aroma of life. People didn't gag at it. They built their social lives on it, and occasionally died from it. But that's beside the point. In monasteries, however, things were different. Monks were among the cleanest people in Europe. They washed regularly, changed their robes often, and even had indoor plumbing of a sort. Running water flowed through some cloisters. Not exactly a luxury spa, but close enough. They even had designated latrines with primitive sewage systems. Meanwhile, outside the walls, the townsfolk were still arguing about whether water was a sin. Smell wasn't just a matter of hygiene, it was a matter of identity. A noble's scent marked them as refined. A peasant's odor marked them as earthy. And foreigners? They were often described in terms of smell before anything else. Chroniclers would note, rather cruelly, that people from other lands had a peculiar stench, which, given medieval diet and sanitation, was probably mutual. But not all smells were bad. Medieval Europe was deeply aromatic in other ways. The scent of baking bread, spiced wine, pine forests, freshly planned wood. The Middle Ages weren't just rot and dung. They were full of simple, comforting scents, too. Smoke from hearth fires, beeswax candles, fresh hay, the smell of home. For many, those were the scents of safety. When night fell and the streets emptied, that mingling of firelight and food and wool was the smell of survival, of life continuing, even in the shadow of plague and poverty. And speaking of plague, yes, that changed everything. The Black Death arrived in the 14th century and introduced a new obsession with stench. Miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through bad air, became mainstream. People filled their homes with flowers, burned aromatic herbs, and carried pomanders, little metal balls stuffed with spices. Imagine everyone walking around clutching a tiny medieval air freshener. That's basically what happened. Doctors even wore the infamous beaked masks filled with lavender and cloves, believing it would filter the plague. It didn't, but they smelled delightful while dying. Over time, good smells became synonymous with health and holiness, and bad smells meant corruption, moral or physical. A bad odor wasn't just unpleasant, it was suspicious. It meant you were either sinning, sick, or possibly French. But let's not get too carried away. Despite all this, medieval people weren't oblivious. They knew filth caused illness. They just didn't know how. So instead of germ theory, they had smell theory. And honestly, given the options, it was a pretty decent guess. As night settles, imagine walking through a quiet medieval village. You'd smell bread cooling in clay ovens, smoke drifting from a thatched chimney, and maybe, faintly, the river. Not clean, but not vile, just human. The Middle Ages were a world where scent shaped how people saw themselves and one another. A world that didn't separate the sacred from the stinky quite as neatly as we do now. And as you drift off, perhaps that's the real takeaway. To live in medieval Europe was to live close to each other, to the earth, to the smells of life itself, unfiltered, imperfect, real. Let's drift into the next part, where we'll explore the rare, ridiculous, and occasionally deadly world of medieval beauty rituals. Because naturally, if you're already skipping baths, why not rub mercury on your face too? Satirical poems from the 14th century mock widows as calculating and dangerous. The Roman de la Rose describes them as women who weep for a day and rule for a lifetime, which, to be fair, was sometimes accurate. Even the word merry widow, used centuries later, carries that echo, a mixture of envy, admiration, and faint moral panic. Because a woman who survived both marriage and patriarchy was, in some ways, the scariest creature medieval Europe could imagine. Let's drift onward, then, into the more personal stories. The widows who ruled kingdoms, defied kings, and sometimes paid the price for it. Because while death might have freed them from their husbands, it rarely freed them from history. How did medieval people react to twins and birth defects, omens in the cradle? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a world that didn't yet understand biology, but had very strong opinions about it anyway. A world where giving birth to twins could make you either a saint or a witch, and where a child born with a crooked limb, an extra finger, or the wrong-colored hair might be whispered about for generations. So, if you're settled in, lights dimmed, blanket tucked up under your chin, we'll wander slowly through the candlelit streets of medieval Europe, where birth itself was a public event, full of hope, fear, and occasionally a bit of supernatural panic. Let's start in the quietest of places, a medieval birthing chamber. The birth room Imagine, a narrow room lit by rushlights, thick with the smell of smoke, herbs, and warm linen. Outside, the town is asleep. Inside, a woman labors, surrounded by midwives and female relatives. Men are banished from the room. Childbirth was considered women's work, and frankly, most men didn't want to be there anyway. There were no doctors, no antiseptics, and certainly no epidurals. There were prayers, charms, and the occasional amulet tied around a wrist. If things went badly, everyone assumed it was the will of God. If things went too strangely, they assumed something far more sinister. Now, a single healthy baby was already a miracle by medieval standards. Infant mortality rates were staggering, but when 2 babies emerged instead of 1, things got complicated. Double trouble. The problem with twins medieval Europe didn't quite know what to make of twins. In some places, they were considered blessed, signs of divine favor. In others, they were deeply suspicious, as if nature had glitched and accidentally hit the copy button. Theologians debated whether twins shared a soul, or whether one might be soulless, an empty vessel sent to test faith. Because of course they did. There was even speculation that one twin was legitimate and the other was, somehow, the devil's counterfeit. A twin birth could be cause for celebration, or for immediate confession. People whispered that a woman couldn't produce 2 children from one act of conception, meaning she must have lain with 2 men, one of them, naturally, being Satan. In medieval France, the Church officially discouraged this line of thinking, but unofficially, priests often joined in. A twin birth might lead to public penance, or a hurried baptism in case one baby turned out to be evil before, mourning, and if one twin died early, which happened often, it was sometimes seen as proof that the surviving child had absorbed their sibling's soul, a miracle, or a crime of nature, depending on who you asked. Conjoined twins and other monstrous births. And then there were those births that stopped entire villages cold. Conjoined twins, children with deformities, babies born with visible abnormalities, these were known collectively as monstrous births. Not monstrous in the modern sense of cruelty, but literally as monstra, signs. They were divine messages, physical omens written on the body. If a baby was born with fused limbs, people believed God was sending a warning. If a child had 2 heads, perhaps it was a symbol of division in the kingdom. If one was born covered in hair, a wolf child, clearly the local nobility had angered heaven again. Chroniclers loved these stories. A malformed child born in Bavaria might be recorded in the same tone as an eclipse or a comet. Something seen in the heavens and on earth at once. One famous case comes from 13th century England. 2-headed twins born near Canterbury. The local bishop immediately declared it a sign of sin among the clergy. The parents were quietly advised to baptize both heads separately, just to be safe. It wasn't medicine. It was theology disguised as obstetrics. The role of the midwives were the first witnesses to these strange events, and they bore much of the social risk. A midwife who delivered a monstrous child could be accused of witchcraft, especially if the mother had enemies. After all, someone had to be blamed. So, they learned to perform subtle diplomacy alongside their work. A crooked limb might be a trick of the light. A cleft palate could be a sign of strength. And if a baby truly looked unusual, the midwife might quietly hide it until she could call the local priest. Not to heal it, but to explain it. One 15th century French manual for midwives even advised them to bury the evidence of imperfect births before gossip could spread. It wasn't cruel in their minds. It was merciful. Better that people think the baby stillborn than believe a demon had been born into their street. The fear of maternal sin, everything. In medieval medicine came back to morality. If a baby was born deformed, the fault lay not in the stars, but in the womb, or more precisely, in the mother's behavior. It was widely believed that what a woman thought about during pregnancy could shape her child's body. So if she looked at a toad, or a hunchback, or even a strange painting, her baby might imprint that image. This was called maternal impression, and it survived well into the 18th century. You can imagine the pressure. A pregnant woman was expected to keep her eyes pure, her thoughts chaste, and her mind serene, which is difficult to do when everyone is constantly warning you not to imagine a donkey. In the eyes of the Church, physical deformity equaled moral deformity. It was the outer reflection of inner sin, or sometimes the sins of an entire community. A malformed child could be seen as divine punishment for the town's greed or a noble's arrogance. In that sense, every birth was a referendum on local morality. When the church got involved, of course, the church had opinions. It always did. Theologians tied themselves in knots, trying to reconcile deformity with the idea of a perfect creator. If God made all things good, then what exactly was a baby with two heads? Some argued that such births were simply natural accidents. Deviations permitted, but not caused by God. Others claimed they were direct messages, like letters from heaven written in flesh. Either way, they were treated as news. Monks recorded them in their chronicles. Traveling merchants carried the stories between towns, and soon people began to collect drawings of these wonders, early versions of illustrated tabloids. By the late Middle Ages, monstrous births were part of Europe's moral imagination. They appeared in sermons, woodcuts, and broadsheets. If a prince rebelled against the king, a deformed calf would conveniently appear somewhere the following week. Coincidence? Of course. Twins as portents of power, but not every twin birth caused panic. Sometimes it caused prophecy. Royal twins, rare as they were, attracted enormous attention. If a noble woman bore twins, it could be spun as a symbol of abundance, divine favor, or even proof of a dynasty's strength. In Renaissance Italy, astrologers rushed to cast dual horoscopes, trying to predict which child would rule and which would die young. Of course, only one could inherit. That made twin births in noble families quietly dangerous. They created uncertainty, potential succession crises, and endless speculation about legitimacy. The French chroniclers had a saying, "Where there are two crowns in one cradle, blood will follow," and it often did. When King Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, gave birth to a stillborn son in 1510, there were rumors she'd carried twins, one alive, one dead. The gossip was baseless, but it fit neatly into the era's superstition. Two births meant imbalance, and imbalance meant divine displeasure, because naturally everything came back to God being either pleased or deeply annoyed. The monster books. By the 15th century, Europe developed a strange obsession with cataloging deformities. Artists and natural philosophers began collecting woodcuts of babies born with wings, tails, multiple limbs, or animal features. These were compiled into Wunderbücher, books of wonders. They weren't medical references. They were moral encyclopedias, visual sermons showing what happened when people angered heaven, A woman gave birth to a frog-like baby? Clearly, too much vanity. A man sired a child with horns? Obviously, greed. The monsters were symbols, not individuals, walking parables for everyone else's comfort. One particularly grim illustration from Nuremberg shows a child with one human leg and one goose leg. It's labeled simply, "Born of Lust." That's medieval subtlety for you, quiet kindness, and yet, beneath all this judgment, there were moments of quiet compassion. In small villages, people sometimes raised deformed or unusual children in secret. Mothers hid them, baptized them quietly, and prayed that gossip would die before the priest found out. A few records survive of such children being accepted, even loved, by their communities, as though everyone silently agreed to pretend they were ordinary. It's a rare glimpse of humanity cutting through the fear, because despite everything, the sermons, the superstitions, the whispers, people still had to hold the child, feed it, and listen to it breathe at night. The medieval world could be cruel, but it wasn't always heartless. Sometimes people simply looked the other way and let love win over doctrine. Let's drift onward, then to the stranger cases, to the miracle children, the court curiosities, and the royals who turned deformity into performance. Because by the Renaissance, the elite found a way to turn even monstrous births into public entertainment. What did executioners do when they weren't executing people? The loneliest job in Europe. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a profession most people tried very hard to avoid. So, if you've already brushed your teeth and dimmed the lights, let's settle in and meet the executioners of medieval Europe. The men whose job description could be summed up as, do terrible things, so others don't have to. Now, the good news is that we're not here to relive their workday. No axes swinging, no gallows creaking. This isn't that kind of story. We're here for the quiet hours in between, for the long stretches of time when no one needed anyone hanged, beheaded, or broken on a wheel. What did they do then? What does a professional killer do when business is slow? It turns out, quite a lot, though none of it made them any more popular. A job nobody wanted. Let's begin with the obvious. Nobody wanted to be an executioner. If you were, it was almost never your idea. In many towns, the job went to whoever had committed a crime serious enough to warrant hanging, but who also happened to have a steady hand. The local authorities would offer a deal. Take the position, and you get to live. Refuse, and, well, the vacancy fills itself. So, the first thing to understand is that most executioners began their careers not as volunteers, but as condemned men. It's not exactly the kind of resume that opens doors at parties. And once you accepted, you couldn't just resign. You were tied to the job and to your reputation for life. You could move towns, change your name, even start over. But word always got around. You were the hangman, and so, when they weren't carrying out executions, they found themselves living in a peculiar state of social limbo, legally employed, sometimes even well paid, but shunned by almost everyone. Life on the edge of town, executioners often lived literally outside the city walls. Not metaphorically, actually outside them. Their houses were built near gallows fields, leper hospitals or garbage pits, lovely neighbors, all around. The hangman's house was usually easy to spot. It was the one everyone avoided walking past. People crossed the street to keep from touching the same air. Children were warned not to play near it, and even priests sometimes hesitated to bless it. And yet, strangely, these were some of the cleanest and most orderly homes around. Executioners had to maintain a degree of precision and discipline. It was, after all, part of their professional image. You couldn't very well turn up to a beheading unprepared. You had to keep your axe sharp, your rope clean, and your conscience, well, as clean as possible under the circumstances, so, while everyone else imagined them as monsters, many executioners spent their free hours doing surprisingly domestic things, sharpening tools, maintaining ledgers, brewing beer, caring for their animals. It was, in its own way, the most orderly corner of chaos you could find. The family business execution wasn't a glamorous career, but it was, oddly, a stable one. Once you were branded with the profession, your children inherited it, willingly or not. Other towns wouldn't accept them for any other trade, and guilds refused to let the children of executioners join. So, the trade became hereditary, and so you had families like the Frants in Germany, or the Sansons in France, dynasties of deathmen who, over generations, built up an uncomfortable kind of respectability. The Frants served for over a century in Nuremberg, passing down the same swords, the same routines, even the same bookkeeping habits. Some kept meticulous records of every execution, listing the condemned's crimes, last words, and even notes on how cleanly the job went. One executioner, Franz Schmidt, again from Nuremberg, left a diary so detailed it reads like a strange mixture of criminal ledger and quiet confession. He described his work with cold precision, but also spent time noting his garden, his household repairs, and his attempts to heal people in his spare time. Because yes, and this might surprise you, executioners were often the best healers in town. When the hangman was also the healer, it sounds absurd, doesn't it? But think about it. Executioners had an intimate knowledge of anatomy, whether they wanted it or not. They knew where tendons ran, how joints worked, how arteries bled. And because no one else wanted to touch the sick, the dying, or the contagious, the job of healer often fell to them by default. In German towns, they were known as the Scharfrichter, or sharp judges. They could set bones, drain abscesses, perform amputations, and brew their own medicines. People might not like them, but when their leg went gangrenous, they came knocking anyway. It was a bizarre double life. In the morning, the hangman might carry out a sentence. That evening, he might be summoned to treat a nobleman's infected wound. Publicly despised, privately indispensable. Many executioners became experts in herbalism and surgery. Some were consulted by physicians, though, of course, no doctor would ever publicly admit it. Franz Schmidt treated hundreds of patients over his lifetime, even obtaining a special dispensation to practice medicine after retirement. He executed 361 people and healed far more. When business was slow, executions weren't exactly daily occurrences, unless you were in a very unlucky city. So in between, executioners had to find other sources of income. Some became butchers, because if you already had a strong stomach and a sharp knife, you might as well. Others disposed of dead animals, cleaned out cesspits, or ran tanneries. These were all polluted professions, the kind nobody else wanted, but necessary to keep cities running. In a strange way, the executioner was like a municipal handyman for everything unclean. Need to remove a rotting cow from the river? Call the hangman. Need to burn confiscated contraband? Hangman again. Need to clean the jail? Fix the gallows? Bury an unbaptized infant? Or drown a bag of stray dogs? You can guess who got that call. It's easy to imagine how all this work blurred together. Killing, cleaning, curing, and disposing. It made them useful and completely untouchable. The perks. No one wanted now. The odd part is that executioners were often quite well paid. Cities recognized that they couldn't just hire anyone. You needed someone reliable, not too squeamish, and preferably sober. Most of the time, so they were paid in coin, food, housing, and the right to collect certain privileges. In some towns, they could claim the clothes or belongings of the condemned. In others, they had the exclusive right to sell the rope used for hangings. Considered absurdly a lucky charm, a tiny piece could fetch a high price on the black market, said to bring good fortune or ward off evil. Because, of course, nothing says good luck quite like a bit of rope from a public execution. Some executioners grew quite wealthy this way. They lived in fine houses, dressed decently, and drank the same wine as the burghers who pretended not to know them. But wealth didn't erase the stigma. Their money was seen as unclean. Even coins from their hands could be refused at market stalls. So, they shopped through intermediaries, wives, daughters, or servants. The family would sneak into town at dawn, buy what was needed, and vanish before gossip caught up. Love and marriage, mostly within the profession. Now, since no one else would marry into an executioner's family, they tended to marry one another. Executioners' daughters married executioners' sons. The same few families intermarried for generations, forming their own strange social microcosm. It was a world apart, bound by necessity and shared exile. Children grew up knowing they'd never escape the name. Even if they left town, someone would remember, and so the cycle continued. Executioners begetting executioners, quietly passing down both skill and stigma. There's something strangely tragic about it. Generation after generation, condemned to live on the edge of town, doing the work everyone needed, but no one respected. Feared, useful, and utterly alone. Let's drift a little further then, to see what else they did to fill those long hours between death sentences. Because, believe it or not, some executioners found creative ways to blend their grim profession with a touch of entrepreneurship. Let's drift now toward a more personal view, the actual daily rhythm of an executioner's home, because, surprisingly, it wasn't all gloom and gallows. It was often domestic, even cozy. The smell of bread baking in the oven, the clink of metal tools being polished, children laughing. Children who would one day inherit both the house and the stigma. And somewhere on a shelf, the city's executioner's sword, carefully wrapped in cloth, waiting for its next appointment. Days could pass like that. Weeks. Months. A kind of suspended tension, like living perpetually on call for something everyone else hoped would never happen. And yet, they endured, because someone had to. Someone had to keep the machinery of punishment ready, clean, and professional, even when there was nothing to punish. Executioners lived on the edge of respectability and on the edge of town. They were the human embodiment of society's conscience, tolerated, necessary, and carefully ignored. So when there were no executions, what did they do? They healed. They brewed beer. They fixed ropes, doctored bones, tended animals, and quietly hoped the peace would last. But not for too long, because rent was still due.